Kairete, ego emi Jakobos Donaldides, ke tutestin ho patrologistes he kene dietheke. Hi, I'm Dr. Seamus MacDonald, and this is a new series in which I'm going to give a lecture, essentially. I'm going to talk my way through the Greek text of New Testament texts, and unlike some other videos I do where I talk entirely in Greek, for example, the Kathemeran channel, in these videos I'm going to be talking and explaining through in English. And so this is a video series really aimed at someone who's done a year or so of traditional Greek. Maybe you've gone to seminary, Bible college, and you've done a program there. And so I assume that you know the basics of Greek, but I don't assume that you are familiar with communicative Greek practices or talking in Greek. And my aim is to talk us through the grammar and the vocabulary of, in this series, John's Gospel. Mostly I'm interested in explaining my understanding of the Greek text, but we will talk about theology a little bit because it's impossible to read an ancient Christian Greek text without talking about what the author is trying to express and how we understand it. And so at least at the level of what is John trying to say, what is the author's theology, we will discuss some of that. But my focus is on verse by verse, what is the Greek saying? So I hope this series will be useful for you and that it will be enjoyable and educational, and hoping that's the first of many to come. Let's dive in then. Kata Ioanen, to Evangelion kata Ioanen, to proton kephalion, ho prologos. This is the prologue of John's Gospel. In arche en hologos, ke hologos en prostontheon, ke theos en hologos. Houtos en in arche prostontheon. Panta diautu egeneto, ke choris autu egeneto, ude hen ho gegonen. And so right at the start of John's Gospel, we are confronted with a number of contentious things grammatically that you may be aware of. Firstly, John begins in verse 1 with in arche. It lacks the article for a number of reasons. One, in Koine Greek, it is not uncommon to lack the article in a prepositional phrase. So it's not necessary to say ente arche to mean in the beginning. Secondly, he's drawing on the Septuagint of Genesis 1:1. And thirdly, it's a temporal phrase. And so you should read in arche as referring to in the beginning, and that has a specific time reference, the beginning of creation, but also the beginning of the source of creation. It's fronted because this is the very first thing we are encountered with. And then en, the verb, the paratatikos, the imperfect of eimi, was. Notice throughout the prologue the way that John contrasts en with egeneto. You can see this coming up in verse 3. Greek has an imperfect but no aorist for past tense options. And so he's contrasting what was progressive with what came into existence. And so it very much does imply the pre-existence and ongoing existence of hologos. Hologos is the subject of the first clause, hologos en in arche, and in my opinion, hologos is one of the most difficult terms in ancient Greek to really get a grasp on. It has such a range of meanings. And so, of course, the most traditional English translations go for something like the word. I think that's a perfectly reasonable translation. In one sense, what hologos means and refers to in John's Gospel can only really be grasped by reading through John's Gospel and seeing what is the word, what is hologos, and who is hologos, and what does this term mean for John. And so, as much as background in the Hebrew and in Greek philosophy matters, I think in one sense reserving some judgment about the meaning of hologos is helpful. Second clause, ke hologos. We have hologos repeated and fronted now. It's the focus of this first verse and the focus of the prologos. En was prostontheon. If this is the first time you've seen prostontheon with something like en and this meaning, it can be a little bit it can throw you. Pros, most students learn, means movement towards, but there's no movement here, which is why it doesn't indicate movement, right? En is a verb that isn't about movement, it's about location or existence. And so pros with an accusative but no motion means in the presence of, in fellowship with, something like that. That's why most translations go for with. He was with Don Theon. And so now we have two participants, two people we're speaking about, Hologos and Hotheos, and the relationship between them is that the Hologos was with, in the presence of, Don Theon. Which is why the third clause here completes this first little verse and completes these three statements, ke Theos en Hologos. Now, this is the part that most people have read debates about or are aware of controversy. A number of things are going on. We're being told essentially that X is Y. X is Y state or a predicate statement. And an X and Y statement can be of two main sorts. One, we're going to be talking about two things that are identical. That is, there can be an identity relationship where X and Y are reversible statements. For example, Seamus is the lecturer of this series. The lecturer of this series is Seamus. There is an identity relationship between lecturer of this series and Seamus. They are one and the same. Or there can be a class relationship. For example, salmon is a fish. That's a statement where X is a Y, but Y is not an X. You cannot say a fish is salmon because there are so many other fish that count as fish. And so that's more of a class relationship. What's going on in this statement, and how do we determine which is the X and which is the Y? Generally speaking, in this kind of clause, the noun that has the article is the subject. So we're saying something about Hologos. Hologos was Theos. Second thing to say is Theos doesn't have an article. That is not uncommon. And it's fronted. That is also not uncommon. And so we're saying essentially, and the Word was God. You cannot say that this verse teaches, because it lacks an article, Hologos en Theos, the Word was a God. That is the way Jehovah's Witnesses interpret this verse. It is not grounded in a good understanding of Greek grammar. It could be what the verse was saying if there was a broader context that supported that reading, but it's not. You can't rule that in, and you definitely can't rule out Hologos and Theos as, and the Word was God. Part of the necessary understanding for us is what category of being and class is Theos. Within John's Gospel, Theos, there is one Theos that is the one and only God of Israel. And so the traditional understanding here stands. There are some arguments that this should be understood qualitatively rather than in a sense that the word, Hologos, was qualitatively a God-like, that is a God thing. I think that's probably accurate to the grammar. It's just difficult for English speakers to grasp that in a way that doesn't lead into problems in their theology and problems in the way they read John's Gospel. I think John is very sophisticatedly trying to express what we call the doctrine of the Trinity. That is, throughout the rest of John's Gospel, you can see that there is an identity relationship where the Father and the Son, Hotheos kai Hologos, they are God within the monotheistic view of John, and yet they are also distinct. How else would John express that than with a statement like this? Hutos, this referent, who's the referent? Hologos, the one we're talking about. Hutos en in arche pros ton theon. Verse 2 is a summary statement that wraps up and restates the three elements of verse 1. Hutos en in arche, 1a, pros ton theon, that's 1b, and he doesn't really restate 1-3, but it's wrapped up almost like 1 and 2 are to be read together. Panta diautu egeneto. Now we shift from en to egeneto. Everything, panta, diautu, through him, egeneto, came into existence. And so the contrast in the prologue is what was and what came into existence. Panta here must necessarily exclude, logically, hologos. Everything else came into existence through him, that is through the logos. Ke choris autu, and choris apart from or without, takes a genike, a genitive, and without him, egeneto udehen. Udehen might normally be contracted into uden, nothing. Udehen, not even one thing. Ho gegonon, which came into existence. The second part of verse 3 is emphatically restating the first part of verse 3 by negation. Apart from him came into existence not one thing which came into existence. Every single thing that came into existence through him. In auto zoeen, ke zoeen to phos ton anthropon, ke to phos in descotia faini, ke hescotia auto u kateleben. You may be aware that there is a textual variant question about verse 3 and verse 4, whether the end of verse 3, ho gegonen, should be read as the start of the next clause with in auto zoeen. What came into existence in him was life. That is not an uncommon patristic punctuation, for example. I think the standard punctuation now in text critical, I'm persuaded that it's correct, that verse 4 or that sentence really does begin with in auto. I think it's a better reading based on how John uses sentences starting with en and a dotike, dative. And I think that ho gegonen makes better sense as the end of what's going on in verse 3. So in auto, in hologos, in the word, zoeen. Zoe here, again, fronted in front of en, was life. Ke zoe, and the life. And so the second one is articular, has an article, to arthron, because we've established that we're talking about this particular life. Zoe, again, is conceptually very important within John's Gospel. One of the features of the prologue is that many key vocabulary items, words, which will be explored throughout the Gospel, appear in the prologue, setting you up for the Gospel as a whole. One of the features of John's Gospel, let me say, is this, that I think the Greek is relatively simple grammatically, but the Gospel as a literary text is literarily sophisticated and complex. And so life was in him, and hezoe and tophos. Here we have another predicate statement, an equative verb, and in this context they both have articles. The general principle here is whichever noun comes first. Hezoe comes first here, it's in front of the verb as well. The life was the light. Tophos ton anthropon, the light of human beings. Tophos, once more, is another key word and theme throughout the Gospel, which is explored in greater depth. Ke tophos in te scotia pheni, and the light, tophos, in te scotia, in the darkness, pheni, shines. Shines, emits light. There's a couple of different words for darkness with a little bit of variation. Here, hescotia, feminine version. Ke hescotia, notice how John often has a second half of the verse, or a second half of a pair that parallels or inverts and expresses the opposite, or does something like that. Ke hescotia, and the light, auto, it, u kat eleben. Kat eleben est in aoristos, an aorist verb. Katalambono has a couple of different senses, and so you might see a couple of different English translations of this. It can mean to overcome, to get the upper hand over. It can also mean to understand. In my view, John is deliberately ambiguous here. This darkness did not, often translated has not here, did not grasp it, did not get a hold on it. And the it we're referring to is tophos, the light. But we're already talking about the fact that the light is the life, or the life is the light, and life is in the logos. There is an identity relationship here. So that's why auto is udetron, neuter. It's referring to tophos grammatically, but semantically we're referring to hologos. And so I think, yeah, as I said, I think there's a double entendre there, a double meaning that's played out in the Gospel. People, one, cannot understand Jesus. Two, they cannot get a grip on him. I think that's seen partly in the way Jesus evades capture at several points in a miraculous way. And finally, they cannot defeat Jesus. Egeneto anthropos apistelmenos paratheu onoma auto Ioannes. Houtos elthen is marturian hina marturese peritu photos, hina pantes pistevsos in di autu, uc enikinos tuphos al hina marturese peritu photos. Now we get a shift in the prologue. Egeneto introduces a new person or character or scene or something like that, and it's contrasting with the en of hologos. Egeneto anthropos, a human being came on the scene, turned up, came into existence. It's not exactly specifying that, but in terms of the story, it's contrasting with what was and now with what came into scene, into our sight. And anthropos came along. Apistalmenos paratheu. Apistalmenos from the verb apostello, to send out. This is a perfect parakimenos participle, metoke, and it's mese diathesis, middle voice, or passive as some would say, but I don't use the word passive like that. Two things help you recognize the perfect middle participle. Firstly, reduplication. Here reduplication, because st as the front of the stem before the preposition apo, it can't reduplicate, so it takes an epsilon. So this can't be an augment because you don't get an augment outside the indicative. Second thing that helps you recognize middle participles in the perfect is that the accent, there's no connecting vowel here, and so the accent never goes past the men syllable. It's always on the men syllable. So sent, or having been sent, para theu. Para metates genikes with the genitive, from or by. There's a double sense here. In one sense, I don't think you can split the difference between sent by God and sent from God. That is, God is the personal agent from whom and who is doing the sending of John. Onoma autor Ioannes. The name to him was John. So no verb in this clause, but there doesn't need to be one. Another way of saying this might have been onomati Ioannes, John by name. The autor, the dotike, the dative, is expressing reference or possession, the name, what that belongs to him or that refers to him. Houtos elthen is marturian hina marturese peritu photos. Houtos, this guy, the one we're talking about, he, John, elthen, aoristos, from the verb erkomai, he came, is marturian, is here with an abstract kind of noun. Marturian expresses purpose, for the purpose of testimony. Again, this is one more important theme and concept through John's Gospel, witness and testimony. And so that is for the purpose of, unto, rather than spatial movement. This is followed on here with two purpose clauses. I think the first purpose clause explains is marturian, and the second one gives the follow-on purpose from the first purpose clause. When you get two purpose clauses in a row, it's very often expressing a sequence of purpose. One purpose, and what is the purpose of that purpose? Something further. So, hina marturese, that he might testify, hina with a hypotactike subjunctive marked by the long vowel there, that he might testify peritu photos, about the light. Hina, that is, what's the purpose of his testimony? Second purpose, further purpose, hina pantes, so that all people, pantes being masculine referring to people, pistevsosin, again, hypotactike, marked by the long vowel here, it's aorist, that all people might believe through him, that is, through him as an intermediary, through his testimony. Uk en ikinos tophos Allah, so the uk and the Allah here provide a contrast. He was not this, but, and the Allah is also not just contrasting, but correcting. Uk en ekinos, that guy, John, was not tophos, he wasn't the light. So clarifying for the reader that John is not the light. He comes to testify about the light, he's not the light. Al, contrast and correction, but hina marturese, but in order that he testify peritu photos, about the light. Understood in verse 8, there's kind of an ellipsis, but he came. He came in order to testify, but it's not restated word for word. En to phos to alethinon, ho photisdi panta anthropon, erkomenon iston kosmon. Into cosmo en, ke ho cosmos di autou egeneto, ke ho cosmos auton uk egno. Verse 9 is more difficult or tricky than it might first appear, especially if you know it well in English translation. There are a couple of questions that we need to wrestle with. Firstly, what is the subject of the hupokimenon, the subject of the verb en? Two main options. One, we can assume that it is carrying on from the previous verse and the previous context, and so it was, or he was, that is not John, but the other figure, Tophos. That one was Tophos to alethinon. That one was the true light. In that case, Tophos to alethinon is the complement. It's the Y, where X is supplied from context. Second option is that Tophos to alethinon is the subject of en. The true light was. And partly this depends on how you read erkomenon in the third line here. Erkomenon is a participle, metoke. It ends in on, and so it's a little bit ambiguous. Is it grammatically masculine, in which case it would be accusative, aitiatike, and in which case it applies to anthropon just before it? That's the only option if it's accusative. Or is it udetron, neuter, and does it apply to tophos to alethinon? And even so, there's still two ways to read it. So I think there's three main options. Let's kind of run through each of them. I'll tell you my opinion at the end. First option, en tophos to alethinon. He was the true light, to alethinon phos. Ho photisdi, which illuminates. Photisdi is a kind of a causative version with the, of light, brings light upon. Panta anthropon, upon every human being. Erkomenon iston kosmon, coming into the world. If erkomenon is accusative, then it's explaining and qualifying every person, almost like every person who or as they come into the world. The true light casts light on them, illuminates them. Or, the second part again, photisdi panta anthropon, who illuminates, which illuminates every human being. And then erkomenon takes you back to talk about tophos. He was the true light that is coming into the world, discussing the light coming into the world. If we take tophos to alethinon as the subject of verse 9 of the verb en, we start off like this. And the true light was, which illuminates every human being, coming into the world. In that case, it's kind of a bit causal or explanatory, explaining that coming into the world is the means and the basis for which the true light illuminates every human being. The third option is to take en as the main verb, as an auxiliary with erkomenon. The main difficulty with this people often have is that Greek does not like to use periphrastic tenses, and so if you've paid attention in Greek grammar, you shouldn't say I am walking with something like ego imi badizdon, I am walking. You should just use the present tense, badizdon. Same with the imperfect. You shouldn't use the imperfect of imi and then a participle. That said, you do find that structure sometimes, and it can be used within the New Testament in some places very clearly. That could be how to understand this. And in fact, I think that is how to understand this. En tophos to alethinon, and he was the true light, which illuminates every human being, and the true light was coming into the world. It leads on then to verse 10, which again is a bit of a resumptive statement. Into cosmo en, he was in the world, ke ho cosmos, di autou egeneto. This is resumptive, right? In the sense that we already had panta di autou egeneto, and the world, the cosmos, came into existence through him, ke ho cosmos auton. Notice that auton is masculine. Ke cosmos auton uk egno, did not know him. To whom or what does auton refer to? I think the natural way to read that is it refers back to hologos, which is grammatically masculine, which is part of understanding that even though we switch to talk about tophos, the main subject of the prologue is still hologos. And so that's who John still has in mind. Hologos estin tophos, right? The logos is the light that we're talking about. The other thing to say here, obviously, is that cosmos, again, is a thematically important word within John's Gospel. And so the relationship between God and the logos and the cosmos is, again, an important theme to look for through the rest of the Gospel. Ista idia elten ke ho idioi auton u parelaben, hosoi de elaben auton, edo ken autois uxusia antekna teu genestai, tois pisteus in ista onoma autu. Number of interesting features here. Firstly, if you haven't noticed yet, notice the way, firstly, that John uses kai or care a lot. He doesn't use a full range of Greek conjunctions and particles. He does use de, but his use of de is probably more limited than a Greek writer typically. And sometimes he doesn't use anything at the start of a clause or a transition. That's almost what you see here, I think, in verse 11. Ista idia elten. He came to ta idia, his own. Ta idia is udeteron, neuter, and so it could be understood in a more abstract sense to his own things, to his own possessions, to his own property. It is possible to use the neuter in Greek to refer to people. That strikes some of us as unusual, especially if you got used to thinking, if we're talking about people, we must use masculine or feminine. Neuter is always objects. That is not strictly speaking true. And so I don't think it's unreasonable to read the first idia as people, especially given hoi idioi, which follows. But he certainly came to that which belonged to him. Why? Theologically, I think the connection between hologos and hotheos means that the world and the creation and the people in it belong to hologos. But there is also within John's Gospel a sense that this refers to hoi judaioi, the Jews in particular. Ista idia elten, he came to his own. Ke hoi idioi, his own, the idios. Idios very often refers to what belongs to oneself, to what's private citizens, private property. And so hoi idio, his own, that is the people who relate to him, his own people, auton u par elabon. Par elabon estin aioristos, from para lambano, they did not take him or receive him. The para, I think, really gives the idea of receive. Hosoi there. The hosoi, first of all, hosoi is relative, it's a correlative, that is, as many as. It is often fronted or led into by a pantes hosoi, as many as, and so it's qualifying a group about which we're going to say something. Second thing to say is this is a kind of a relative clause that it's moved to the left, so it's hanging or pendant. Its explanation about what we want to say about this group doesn't come until the phrase that comes after the clause edok and autois he gave to them. And so it's kind of fronted for emphasis and to introduce and focus on this new group. Hosoide, but as many as elebon auton, received him. So even though elebon here lacks the para from the previous sentence, I think the force of par elebon carries on to the simpler version, elebon, lambano. As many as received him, edoken he gave, aoristos of didomi. You can recognize in the aorist of didomi because it doesn't have reduplication. The present has reduplication with delta iota. The perfect has reduplication with delta epsilon. The aorist verbs do not have reduplication. So he gave to them, autois, exousian, he gave to them authority, tekna theou genestai from gignomai, the aorist infinitive, to become children of God. John's Gospel has a strong preference to use teknon or tekna to talk about being children of God, because he generally reserves the word huios son or sons to refer to Jesus himself. Tois pisteusin is explanatory of autois. It's further explaining, and here it's moved to the right really, we're explaining autois. Who are the autois? Who are the hosoi elebon auton? Those that believe, pisteusin, this is a metoke participle, dotike dative. The dative plural masculine participle often looks like it's a indicative verb, but it's not. You can tell it's not because of the syntax, and because here it's got an article in front of it. Tois pisteusin. To those that believe isto onoma autu, in his name. Again, it's quite common in John's Gospel to express pisteo, to believe or trust, with an ace and a noun in the accusative rather than a dative expression. And to onoma, his name, the name standing in or representing the whole person. Those that believe in Jesus, those that trust in Jesus. Hoi uk ex hematon, ude ek thelematos sarkos, ude ek thelematos andros, alektheu egenethesan. Hoi, relative pronoun, referring to those who, and so we're fleshing out who are the ones who believe in the name, who are the ones who receive him. Those who, and then we're given 3 negated statements, and then 1 contrast and correction statement. So uk, ude, ude. And ude is functionally equivalent to kai u. Kai u is not the way you should express and not in Greek. You should usually use ude. So it's neither this nor this nor this, but contrast and correction, this. And then we have the verb right at the end. So they are those who egenethesan, this is from genao, to beget or to bring into creation, to birth, depending on who we're talking about. And so not gignomai, but genaomai, genao. It is a theta eta middle aorist, what some people will call an aorist passive, but I wouldn't. And so they who, I don't think word begotten is great English for a contemporary speaker, but who were born is probably not bad. How are they born? And then we have ek, ex, ek, ek, ek. These ek phrases are kind of expressing agency or means. Not born of bloods. First, the use of the plural is slightly unusual and a little bit difficult to explain. Secondly, haima, blood, very often associated here in ancient thought and texts with the physicality of procreation. And so not born of physical birth, physical procreation and sex. Ude ek thelematos sarkos, neither from the thelema, related to the verb thelo or ethelo, to desire, to want, to wish, to will, sarkos, of the flesh. So not born from the will of the flesh. It's important to understand that sarx in Paul's writing often has a very negative sense because Paul is using sarx in a particular way to refer to the sinful nature, as the NIV likes to translate it. That's not always the use of sarx, and I don't think that's the way John uses it. I think he's talking about the fact that the human physical body has natural desires for sex and procreation, and that's what thelematos sarkos does. Not from the will of the flesh, the desire of the flesh. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but that's not the kind of birth we're talking about. Ude ek thelematos andros, nor from the will of a man. Do you think andros here carries a gender sense or a sex sense? Not a sexual sense necessarily. That is talking about a man because it's a patriarchal society and the man is fronted as the head of the household, the one who, in one sense, has the power to decide whether to have children. It could be that this is simply rounding off and referring to natural birth of children. It could have in view also the difference between sexual procreation and adoption and other forms of getting a child. None of those means are the means by which these people become tektatheu. Al ektheu, they are born ektheu of God. God is the agent who brings about this birth. Again, this fits into the themes of John's Gospel, where birth is an important concept, and you see that played out in later parts of the Gospel, where John will talk about being born again, being born from above, second birth. It's a supernatural type of birth. It is not ex haimaton, ex thelematos sarkos, ex thelematos andros. Και ο λόγος σάρξ γένετο και εσγένωσεν in χεμήν και εθεασάμετα τεν δοξάν αυτού, δοξάν χος μονογενούς παρά πατρός, πλέρες χαριτός και αληθείας. Και, notice again the use of ke, just to run and as a conjunction, kind of coordinating things, just running things on. And hologos, the logos, egeneto, sarx. Right, this is a really important transition within the prologue. We've had this contrast between hologos en and egeneto anthropos, and yet now something changes. Something is different. Hologos egeneto, the word became. The word became something that it wasn't before. Egeneto sarx, became flesh. Again, this is why it's important to distinguish between John's use of sarx and Paul's. Sarx here refers to the fact that the Logos became flesh, became a living human being, body, with everything that pertains to human bodily existence. It's the incarnation, the insarkification, if we want to mangle our Greek a little bit. He becomes not just anthropos, but he's clearly an anthropos, but sarx emphasizes the physicality of the incarnation. That's the new thing in the life of the Logos. Ke eskenosin, second thing here is eskenosin. This is an uncommon verb. It doesn't appear often. It appears here and I think in the book of Revelation. And he came to dwell in a tent. That's what the sken part is doing, right? And so this is a deliberate reference, deliberately referring to the tabernacle dwelling of God in the Exodus. That is, when God came to dwell in the tents with the people of Israel, so too the Logos, having become flesh, has come to dwell in a temporary dwelling in our midst. This is an important connection between John's theology and the Old Testament. Eskenosin, why is it aorist? Probably this is what people call an ingressive aorist. It's the beginning of something, or you can take it as a holistic action. And he dwelt. En chemin in us, in the sense of among us. So not necessarily in you personally. That's not what this verse is expressing, but in our presence collectively as humanity. Ke ethesametha. The verb here is theaomai, to look upon, to behold, to spectate, to observe. It is naturally middle, or what people might call a deponent. Again, I don't use that term. It is aoristos. The question here is really, who is the subject? Tis estine tines estinto himakimenon. Right? Who is the we that beheld ten doxan autu? Is it all of humanity? Is it more narrow? The grammar does not answer that question. And as you go on in Greek, you'll find that sometimes the grammar itself doesn't answer the questions you might have. It seems to me the two best options are, one, what we might call it the historical angle. We, the witnesses, that is, those who were present and saw, we're the ones who saw. Secondly, what we might call the apostolic witness. And I think there's definitely overlap between those two. If you read 1 John, John's first epistle, which I think is by the same author, you get a similar concept of apostolic and historical eyewitness testimony to the incarnation and the incarnate Christ. We have seen ten doxa nautu. Doxa, once more, a rich concept, rich in Old Testament background and rich within John's Gospel. It's the manifestation, particularly of God's qualities, his nature, his attributes, it's his holiness, it's his glory. Doxan hos monogenus. A glory as, hos is a kind of a comparison here, as of a monogenus. The nominative form of this adjective, monogenes, So much has been discussed about this. The two main translations you'll see are only begotten and unique, or one of a kind. I've done my own work on this. I've written some material. I have a paper that will probably never be published because I'm not publishing. But I think it's important to think through, firstly, only begotten does not mean much to most contemporary English speakers. No one uses that phrase apart from talking about this word in the Gospels, especially in John's prologue. Secondly, when we talk about unique or one of a kind, the question you should ask is, in what sense unique? One in a kind in relationship to what? The best evidence that I've worked through myself, looking through all of Greek literature leading up to John's Gospel, and then the way that this word is understood even post John's Gospel, is that it means someone who is an only child. That is, they lack siblings. That is the main use of this verb, or this adjective, sorry, when talking about people. Lacking siblings means to be an only child. And so only begotten in what sense? The only child. Lacking siblings. That is the sense which seems to me that John uses it as well. That talking about the Logos that became incarnate, talking about Jesus, there are no other sons or daughters of the same kind. That's part of why John uses the word tekna to talk about ta tekno to theo, the children of God, because those who believe in Jesus do not become sons or children in the same category as Jesus is the Son of the Father. So that's my best understanding of monogenes. It's difficult to choose a best translation. I think unique son works because you've got the idea that he's a son, but he's the only son. He's unique. He has no siblings. Para patros, from the Father. That is the source of the Son, the monogenes, is the para patros, from the Father. Pleres charitos ke alethias, full of grace and truth. This is almost certainly an Old Testament allusion, I think, to Exodus 34, full of grace and truth, picking up the language of glory. Ioannes marturi periautu, ke kekragen legon, hutos en honipon, ho episomu erkomenos, em prosthenmu gegonen, hoti protosmu en. Hoti ectu preromatos autu chemis pantes elabomen ke charin anticharatos. Hoti honomos dia Moiseos edote, he charis ke heletia dia Jesu Christu egeneto. John Marturi testifies. This is the first of what people call a historical present. That is, we're telling a story in the past, we're telling a narrative, but the present tense, enestos chronos, is used. There's a large amount of discussion about what that means in terms of its effect within Greek grammar and Greek texts. My best understanding is that the use of the present tense, especially within John's Gospel, it draws attention to what's about to come next, and it bridges the gap. That's what people usually mean when they say historical present. It bridges the gap and brings it into the present for us. John's testimony, in a sense, is now for us. John testifies to us now as readers, peri autu, about him, ke kekragen, this is the verb kradsdo, to cry out, not in the sense of an emotional outburst, but in the sense of a declaration, a declarative, often a prophetic statement, has cried out, parakimenos chronos, saying, it's very common to have two words of speech, especially one as a participle introducing the speech itself. Hutos, this one, that's hologos, that's Jesus. This one was hon ipon, the one whom I said, or the one whom I spoke. So hon here is an aithiatige, direct object of ipon. We might translate it differently into English, about whom I said. But the one whom I said, that's another way to express it. And then we get the statement of John. So John quoting himself about something he himself had said previously. This is John the Baptist, let's be clear. Ho opissumu erkomenos. It's useful to read ho opissumu erkomenos as a unit. The one coming opissumu, after me. Opisso tends to be a spatial reference, but here I think it's being used temporally. That is, it's about time. The one who comes after me, that is second in sequence to John, emprosthen mu gegonen. Emprosthen normally means in front of. Gegonen, the parakimenos perfect of gingomai, has become in front of me. How do we understand these two things? If Jesus comes after John, how has he come to be in front? The sense is different. So the sense of opissumu, it seems to be temporal. The sense of emprosthenmu is about status. He has come to be ahead of me in status, above me in status. So we would use above in English, but here we use in front. Prior to me in status. Why? Hoti, because, this is a causal hoti, protos muen. Protos normally means first, but here it's being used almost in a comparative structure. He was prior, and then the genike, mu, genitive, is of comparison. He was prior to me. So this goes back to the temporal, and this expresses the paradox that the Logos was temporarily prior, in time prior to John, because John came into existence by the Logos and he came after John in time, in this space-time continuum, and yet he has come to be superior to John, emprosthenmu. That's the paradox that John is trying to express with these words here. Hoti, the second hoti takes us out of John's statement. Think back to the author speaking. He's explaining some of this. Ektu pleromatos autu, out of his pleroma, out of his fullness, chemis pantes, emphatic here, we all elabomen, same sense as par elabomen earlier, we take, we receive, we get hold of. Kai karin antikaratos, even, I think the kai here is an assensive or adverbial use of kai. Karin, grace, anti, in place of, karitos, grace. Second grace is in the genitive because anti takes the genitive. We have received grace in place of grace. Again, different translations of this little part here, karin anti karitos. How do we understand grace in place of grace? Some translations go for an additional idea, grace on top of grace. I think the weakness of that is that anti, it really is a replacement kind of structure. Grace in place of grace. And I think that's explained in verse 17. So let's work through 17 and then come back and think about charin. Hoti, because ho nomos dia mouseos edothe. The nomos, the law, traditionally translated, dia mouseos, through Moses, the means or the mediation. That's what the dia here is expressing. Edothe from the verb didomi. This is an aoristos. Theta eta middle was given. And so you can tell it is aorist. Why? Because there's no duplication, as I said earlier. We have the theta eta for the theta eta middle, and then we have an augment, and that's how we know what this verb's doing. As I said just a moment ago, ho nomos is typically translated law. That's how people refer to the Old Testament generally, specifically the 5 books of Moses, the law of Moses, the Torah. I think it's not a bad idea sometimes to retain the language of Torah in English rather than law, because Torah refers to instruction, and law, when an English speaker hears it, they immediately think rules, regulations, and a juridical code. That is not everything that nomos is expressing, either in Greek or in the Hebrew Torah. And so it can be advantageous sometimes to kind of distance ourselves from traditional English translations. But the nomos of the Old Testament, the nomos especially of Moses, was given through Moses. He charis ke heletia, grace and truth. And in English, the use of the articles here, to arthon, I would put a big capital G with my grace and a big capital T with my truth. Conceptually, grace and truth, dia Jesu Christu, through Jesus Christ, egeneto, came. This is the first time in the prologue that he has specifically named Jesus or used the word Christ. I've used those terms a couple of times. I don't think it's unclear reading through the prologue that what you're reading is about Jesus Christ, but he's retained and delayed the mention of Jesus Christ until this point. Till this point we've talked about hologos becoming sarx, but now right at the end we're clear, this is Jesus Christ. Notice in verse 17 there is no use of, for example, a mende structure. It's not hoti homen nomos he de charis. John could have done that, but he didn't feel the need to. He allows you to construe these two things based on what they mean, rather than setting you up with those kinds of particles. I think the contrast here suggests again that this is a replacement. In place of the nomos, which came through Moses, now has come the charis kaelethia, which has come into existence through Jesus Christ. It's grace, and so this tells you something important. John's understanding of honomos dia Moses, the law through Moses, is that it is grace. But now a new grace has come, dia tu Jesu Christu. Theon udis georaken popote. Ho monogenes huios, ho on iston kolpon tu patros, ekinos exegesato. Come to the final verse of the prologue here. Firstly, theon is, or you could say, dislocated to the left. It's moved to the left. It's the aitiatike. It's the complement of the verb or the object, people would say, but it's also the focus. That is, it's fronted as the focus. God, udeis, no one, heoraken. This is the perfect of horao, sorry. Horao in the perfect essentially has reduplication twice, or reduplication firstly by lengthening and then with an augment on the front. But it's not an augment, it's reduplication again. Has seen. No one has seen God, popote, ever. Popote. Especially used with some kind of negation. Udes popote. No one has ever seen God. And so that's the fronting statement for what follows. We're going to have a contrast with that, expressing the fact that God in his nature, in his quality, is not a visible being. No one has ever seen God. Ho monogenes huios. I'm going to make a couple of comments about this. Firstly, there's a number of textual variations here. One, that there's no article here, and two, that huios is theos. Let me write my theos in here. So three options really: ho monogenes huios, ho monogenes theos, and monogenes theos. The reading in the text in front of us is the easiest reading and probably, in my opinion, incorrect. That is, it's probably a scribal correction for one of the other two. The monogenes, the son who is monogenes, has no siblings, the unique son. That is a straightforward reading and aligns quite well with John 3 and other parts of the Gospel, especially John 3 though. It's more difficult to read homonogenes theos. That is less expected. It's a more difficult reading, and as a principle of textual criticism, the more difficult reading is often to be preferred. The monogenes theos, the siblingless God, the unique God. And so that's why it's important to think about, unique in what category? Lacking siblings. To drop the article is in fact more difficult, but I think probably even more correct. Monogenes theos, especially the way John seems to drop articles where we might expect them according to the rules of grammar that we've learned. For example, at the start of this verse, ton theon is what you might expect, but John just has theon. The reason I think it's important to go with monogenes theos is that John is distinguishing between ho theos, ho pater, as he'll talk about through the rest of the gospel, God as God the Father, with the one whom John is insistent is, Jesus Christos, ho logos, kai estin theos. Right? Jesus Christ, the Logos, is theos. He's not a different theos to God the Father, but he's not identical to the Father. He is ho huios, and he is monogenes. There's also debate here about whether you should read this as an adjective describing huios or theos, or is this the noun? And this is in apposition, that is, the siblingless one, comma, God, or the siblingless one, comma, the Son. And again, that seems to me to make slightly better sense of the grammar here and John's usage. Monogenes, theos, right? The one who lacks siblings. There's no others in the category of Son of God. There's only one there. That one who also is God, which we learned about in verse 1, that one who is hoon iston kolpon tu patros, the one. So this uses the article following on, and here we have a whole phrase that fills out what that article is doing. It's almost like having a relative clause. We're further defining and telling some information about this siblingless Son/God. The one on, this is the metoke participle from the verb eimi, the one being, iston kolpon. Kolpos is a word not very often used. It refers to the area of the body from the chest down to the thighs, especially when seated, right? The lap. And so he is iston kolpon, he's in the lap, tu patros, of the Father. Is, or eis, normally involves movement or purpose, but the verb here, expressed in the participle eimi, on, doesn't involve any movement. So just as right at the start we had proston theon, here we have no movements involved here, it's just in. This is also the case because in Koine Greek, is is often being used for the preposition en. So he's in the lap of the Father. This is an expression of intimate presence. A similar expression is used when reclining at the Last Supper, anaketai into kolpo, right? Reclining in the lap, that is leaning back against the lap of the person next to you. This is the ongoing presence that the Logos has with Hopatros. Ekinos is kind of resumptive and anaphoric for this one, emphatic as well, or that one, the monogenes theos, the one on iston kolpon tu patros, that one, exegesato. The verb is exegeomai or exegeumai, from which we get the verb exegesis. It means to relate or to explain in detail. He has made him known in detail with clarity, revealing precisely who? Theon. That's why Theon's up the front here, right? And it's fronted, and yet the fullness of this verse comes out at the end. That one, in contrast to the fact that no one has ever seen God, the monogenes theos, hologos, hosax geneto, hoson istor kolpon, that one has made him known clearly and in detail, and now John's ready to begin the narrative of the gospel so that you can see all these themes played out. Thanks so much for joining me for this first lecture on the prologue of John's Gospel and the Greek text of it. I hope you will join me for the next lecture and the many others to come. I'm going to work all the way through John's Gospel. It's going to take a while, so I hope you'll be here for the ride. If you've got any questions, comments, suggestions, let me know in the comments below. Like, subscribe, all those boring things that you're meant to do, and I'll see you soon. Eros there.